Schwimmer, and we didn't want to skip a beat just because we're not in the building. So we appreciate Dan taking the time today to speak with us. First, a quick little housekeeping notes. If you have any difficulties with your audio or video during the session, you can do a private chat to Sarah, and she can try to help you resolve some of your technical situations if they come up. What else can I share with you? I think that's about it for our, there's going to be a speaker. Let me say her name correctly. Dr. Einat Wilf on Tuesday, May 26th. She's a leading intellectual and original thinker on matters of foreign policy, economics, education, and Israel and Jewish people. She is a former member of the Israeli parliament. She wrote a book called The War of Return, and she's going to be presenting on Tuesday, May 26th at 9 a.m. California time, and we'll be sending out in a follow-up email to everybody who attended. We'll send out some more information about that, but I just got that word from JCC Association today. It's an incredible speaker that you're going to be satisfied hearing, I think. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dan Schwimmer as a former chairperson of the local San Diego chapter of AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, and he will tell you a little bit more about himself, and then we'll get started with our Middle East update for today. Thank you so much, Dan. We're going to go ahead and mute everybody at this time, and if you have a question during the time, if you raise your hand, or you can unmute yourself, or you can also put it in the chat, and then we can call on you. Thank you so much.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. This is our new world that we're all getting used to, I guess. I'm not sure for how long, but it's always a pleasure to chat with the group. You know, I'm not sure if we have anybody new here, but the 60-second introduction, most of you have heard many times, is that I've been a member of AIPAC for, I don't know, 30, 40 years, whatever it is. We lobby on behalf of the American-Israel relationship. I'm a self-professed news hound. I'm a history major, and I just love to share current events and listen to what you guys think and have conversations. So I do want to encourage that, as we go along, if something pops into your head, make sure that we get a chance to hear what you'd like to ask or what you'd like to say. I prefer a conversation to a lecture. So I believe I was with the group just after I got back from the policy conference at the beginning of March. I'm trying to remember the exact date, whether we slipped in underneath the quarantine deadlines. But I'll tell you, coming back from March 2nd, 18,000 people in DC, the next couple of weeks were pretty nail-biting for me, waiting to see whether or not I caught anything while I was there. Because if I didn't catch it in that petri dish, because we were all tight and elbowed and cocktailing and eating, and there were virtually no restrictions. Maybe a little bit of an elbow bump here and there, but that was about it. So luckily, nothing happened, and I've checked in with our AIPAC people, and to our knowledge, nobody that we know got sick from the conference. So now, before I get going, I just have to do one thing for Melanie. We all have our special masks these days, and Melanie, I just wanted to make sure that,
Go Bucks, right, George?
I got my special mission. Yeah. So having some fun. Okay, so let's just talk a couple of political things that are happening real quick as an intro. There is, as many people on this call know, one of the provisions of the Iran deal, the JCPOA, from about 5 years ago, was a sunset on conventional arms sales to Iran. That expires in October. That expires in 5 months. The United States and the current administration is very much against having that expire. So AIPAC was supportive of a letter from Congress to Secretary of State Pompeo which 387 members of the House signed. That would be about 89% of the House, signed on to a letter urging him to do everything in the administration's power to not lift that restriction, that embargo. Pompeo has come out and said that he will approach that in 2 phases. Phase 1 is the U.S. will introduce a resolution to the UN Security Council to extend that embargo indefinitely. He expects, and the U.S. expects, that Russia and China will both veto that resolution, because both Russia and China are ramping up to sell Iran some advanced conventional arms. The second phase would be to just unilaterally take the step to extend the sanctions. During the JCPOA negotiation, there was what we all remember, or hopefully remember, the term Snapback Provisions, which said that if Iran violates terms of the deal, that any original member of the agreement can unilaterally snap back sanctions. So Barack Obama said in August of 2015 during the negotiations, he said that if Iran did not comply with the agreement, and I quote, we won't need the support of other members of the UN Security Council. America can trigger the snapback on our own. Now, that's only if Iran is in violation of the agreement. Let me quote, on April 5th, Iran's Atomic Energy Organization head, Ali Akbar Saleh, said, quote, he said, quote, nuclear activities, as well as research and development on the nuclear fuel cycle, uranium conversion and enrichment, including production and storage, are being carried out without any restrictions. He revealed that Iran's enriched uranium production and stockpile are now as high as before the 2015 agreement, which means that they are in violation of every one of those pieces of the agreement. So there's really no argument that they are in violation of the agreement. They can argue that they violated it because America withdrew from the agreement. And of course, that will be the argument as the US goes forward to try to reimpose the embargo or extend the embargo, that, well, wait a minute, you guys withdrew from the agreement. So it's complicated. I don't know that it's going to happen. I think that it's fairly obvious that the hope of the JCPOA to moderate Iran's behavior subsequent to the agreement has not worked. They've gotten more aggressive in their troublemaking in the Middle East. So Iran's response to America's intent to extend comes from Iran's President Rouhani. Last week he said, quote, Iran will give a crushing response if the arms embargo on Tehran is extended. So clearly they are not interested in it. It will be interesting to see where they come up with money to pay for arms that Russia and China might want to sell them, because as the oil market has imploded for various reasons, the virus one, the Russia Saudi Arabian price war on another. Iran, in March, it was reported their oil sales went from 300,000 barrels a day to 50,000 barrels a day. It has now been reported that in April, Iran was giving away their oil to the likes of Syria in order to buy future influence, because there's absolutely nobody to buy it, and they have run out of storage space to store the oil that they have pumped but cannot sell. So they'll have to be digging into reserves. Their economy is in very serious shape. The Iranian parliament, as an example, passed a law or passed authority to change their currency, and they're going to knock 4 zeros off of their currency. So a 10,000 rial note will become a 1 unit of, and I can't remember what the name, I'll get to it here somewhere. They're naming a new currency. So I apologize for that. I've got it in my notes here somewhere. So The second legislative piece that's going on these days is 262 House members and 69 senators signed a letter calling on the administration to stop, I quote, politically motivated investigations of war crimes against the US and Israel by the International Criminal Court, by the ICC in Europe. The ICC was set up for the sole purpose of prosecuting war crimes, egregious war crimes, where there is no established legal system in the country which is alleged to have perpetrated the war crimes. I don't think the United States meets that. I don't think Israel meets that, and neither the United States nor Israel signed on to the agreement that established the ICC because they believe that it would be a politically motivated body rather than a judicially motivated body, and this is a clear instance of that. The head of the International Criminal Court has waived and massaged a bunch of rules saying that Palestine is the Palestinian entity is a state, and it doesn't matter that Israel's not a member, and so they just keep doing all this stuff, and the U.S. and Israel are vehemently opposed to those actions. So we will have to wait and see what happens with that. They took it and they put it aside and they gave it to another department to determine whether this and that. They've been massaging it for a couple of years now. The Palestinians, of course, are very much in favor of trying to pursue Israel and now the United States because of the agreement, the quote unquote peace process agreement, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. Let me take a few minutes and just talk about Iran on a few different fronts. Relative to COVID and Iran, 16 different countries claim that the infections in their countries came directly from Iran. Iran is obviously the center of Shiite Muslim world. They've got the holy sites, a holy city of Qom, K-O-M, which they did not close down until I think maybe even the end of March. They kept pilgrimages and mosques open, and people from all around the world were there and then turned around and went home. But more egregiously, the virus was spread, I'm not going to say intentionally or deliberately, but without any concern for neighboring countries, by Mahan Air, which is one of the two major airlines in Iran. It is controlled by the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is the military wing of the Iranian infrastructure. And because of that close relationship between the IRGC, which deals with all of Iran's military nefariousness, let's say, and involvement in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Iraq, they continued to fly. I'll give you a couple of examples. Mahan Air said it was suspending flights to and from China on February 2nd, in accordance with instructions from the World Health Organization, February 2nd. Between that time and the end of March, Mahan Air flew 157 times between Iran and China. So it's pretty hard not to have been, I mean, they had enough problems with what was already there in the pilgrims, but they continued for 2 months to interact directly with China and continued to fly. After Iraq's announcement, Iraq banned flights from Iran on April 20th, and the UAE introduced a ban on February 25th, and Iran continued to fly to those countries. They continued to fly into Lebanon and Iraq despite bans from those countries because they needed to continue to ship their arms, their fighters, Hezbollah. So they really did quite the job in spreading the virus. It's really too bad. Countries that claim that their outbreaks originated from Iran include Iraq, Afghanistan, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Lebanon, and the UAE. So, you know, some of the earlier cases they can trace directly to flights. The people came right off Iranian flights from Iran, and so it's not real hard to figure it out. Now, relative to the virus, the whole world is working on ways to either mitigate the virus or create a vaccine, right? They're working on testing procedures, they're working on treatment procedures, and they're working on a virus. What is Iran doing to solve the virus problem, to contribute? They're trying to hack everybody else's research. So in the last week or so, there have been numerous reports of Iran targeting the WHO banks and employees, the drug companies in the US especially that are working on drugs, and Israeli companies that are working on drugs for vaccines and treatments. You know, they're not bothering to try to cooperate with anybody or try to develop cures or treatments. They're just trying to steal them, which, I mean, I think that is really telling, and I think it's just a shame. So that's on the virus side. What else is Iran doing on a day-to-day basis in the world to stir up trouble? On April 15th, 11 Iranian speedboats, and that's basically the Iranian Navy, or a bunch of high-speed little attack boats, were harassing U.S. warships in the Gulf, and they were coming within 100 yards of U.S. warships, and just high speed, very close harassment. The U.S. held their fire. There were indications I read after the initial reports that the missile launchers, now some of these boats had missile launchers on them, and their guns were turned in the up position, so not in firing position. Okay, they were either pointed up into the sky or down at the boat, and that's, I'm sure, why the U.S. boats didn't respond, ships didn't respond. But in response to this aggression and to these provocations, 2 days later, President Trump tweeted, quote, "I have instructed the United States Navy to shoot down and destroy any and all Iranian gunboats." I'm not sure how you shoot down a gunboat, but okay, let's just go with the language here. "And all Iranian gunboats if they harass our ships at sea." As I said, we're not going to stand for it. If Iran endangers U.S. ships, we'll shoot them out of the water. Now, Trump has been actually pretty good at holding fire during his administration. He's been provoked several times. I think you may agree or disagree, it's certainly debatable whether this is the right response, but if there's something I've learned over my decades of studying the Middle East, is that most of the governments in the Middle East, most of the Muslim and Arab governments in the Middle East, respect strength and disrespect weakness or negotiation. And I think that Trump is laying down a line in the sand, or in the water as the case may be, that if you continue to do this, we're not going to hold fire anymore. If you want to provoke us, we'll take your ships out of the water. I haven't heard of any subsequent instances since Trump issued that statement. We will have to wait and see whether that happens, what happens if it does, and whether or not that creates a whole new set of problems. Okay, so I get back to the currency. They're changing from a real to a toman, T-O-M-A-N. That's going to be the new currency, and they're going to exchange them at less 4 digits. So 10,000 to 1 is going to be the exchange rate. The last thing that's happened recently relative to Iran is, the United States and Israel for years have designated Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. European nations have held to the storyline that Hezbollah is both a social organization and a military organization. And just about a week or two ago, Germany got on board and said, yeah, no, there's no distinction between the two. Hezbollah is a terrorist organization. They estimate they have about 1,050, or is it 1,500? Yeah, 1,050 representatives or people directly linked to Hezbollah in Germany. They conducted a whole, Germany labeled them a terrorist organization. They went and raided several offices of Hezbollah in Germany and have now, outlawed the entity and any fundraising in Germany. Of course, Israel, the United States, and Germany are now trying to press the rest of the European countries to do the same. Iran's response was that they warned that Germany's ban on the activities of Hezbollah on its soil, saying that Germany would face consequences for its decision to give in to Israeli and U.S. pressure. Okay, we'll see if some of the other European countries take a more realistic approach. I take this step as an indication in the longer process of Europe changing its tune relative to Iran, and possibly right behind that relative to the Palestinians. They've been, in my opinion, out of step with reality for quite a while, and for various self-serving reasons of the EU. And I'm hoping that this is the start of a wider, broader reassessment of their positions. I'll close on Iran with, I think we've all been following in the paper, Venezuela as well. And Venezuela is, got an autocracy with Maduro and millions of Venezuelans have fled the country, and millions more are in poverty. The average person has lost something like 25 pounds in the last year under this regime. Well, there's reports very recently, credible reports, that Venezuela, first of all, Maduro has been cashing out the country's gold reserves because the country's out of money. So he's been bankrupting the country by selling off its gold reserves. There's a report that just recently they loaded 9 tons of gold worth $500 million onto planes bound for Iran. And that is as payment because Iran came and helped Venezuela get their gasoline refineries, which weren't operating because they have no money and they have no equipment to fix them. They came in and gave them the expertise and brought in the equipment and fixed their refineries. And as payment, since they have no money, they gave them some plane loads full of gold. I don't know that they could do that again because I don't think that they have much gold left in their vaults. Let's switch gears a little bit, and what you can see from that is Iran's got its finger in a whole lot of pots, in a whole lot of places where they're trouble spots, and they love to get involved in trouble spots because when there's weakness and there's chaos, there's vacuum, and they can move in easily and they can buy allies and they can make trouble, and that's exactly what they're doing. So let's talk about COVID as a whole for a few minutes, because how can anything that goes on today not talk about COVID? On a large macro scale, the COVID virus is an interesting insight into the European Union experience. The EU for a couple of decades has been like, drop your nationalistic identities and let's form a union, right? So open borders for immigrants, cross-border financial, a single currency, and so moving away from the national model and toward the international, multinational, transnational model. The COVID virus is a huge threat to that model because look what happened as the virus took hold and started to spread. The first thing that countries in the European Union did was close their borders, right? That's an antithesis to the EU model. They said, look, wait a minute, we got to protect our population, our people. We can't just have open borders and people running in here willy-nilly bringing the virus. So we've got to take what steps we think are necessary to protect our people. And the first thing was to close borders. The second thing they did is they said, our resources to fight this virus are our resources. Don't ask us to send them to everybody else. Now, that's a worldwide problem because nobody in the world apparently had enough resources, masks and protective and ventilators, et cetera, et cetera. We all know that list. But again, you undercut that transnational humanitarian aid concept within the EU. So I think that for the last 3.5 years, there's been a huge worldwide discussion about President Trump's emphasis on a national identity, America first policy. And he has been anything but shy about pushing that. But now you're seeing in reality those who had spoken of the opposite taking many measures and many steps that are antithetical to that. And now Europe is going through who's going to pay to try to support and limit the damage that's going on from coronavirus. And as was before, it's the northern countries that are wealthier, the southern countries that need more help, and the northern countries like Germany and France and Belgium are not interested in underwriting Greece, Spain, Portugal, Italy. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens. And I think this is a broad continuum trend that really isn't in the papers much. And I encourage you to watch to see how that translates. The second big broad element of the virus is, how does this affect warfare? How does it affect our ability to field our defense forces? And the prime example of that, of course, is the aircraft carrier, the Teddy Roosevelt. You got 5,000 guys on a multi-billion-dollar ship that has to put into port for a month at a minimum because of hundreds of crew members on board had contracted the virus. And so, how do you run a military? How do you stay trained, prepped? How do you induct and train new guys? How do you have ships with super close quarters? I don't know about any of you, but I've been on an aircraft carrier multiple times, thanks to APAC. And it's incredibly close quarters. There is no way to distance yourself when you're on a ship like that. And so the question is going to be, how does any country, any military in the world keep its military assets and their military personnel trained and deployed so that you can prevent any nefarious opportunistic actions by players in the world who might want to take advantage of that. And I think we're going to see some of that. I don't think we've seen it yet, but when you've got major assets like that down, I mean, the whole controversy over the captain of the aircraft carrier sending out an email to multiple people that then got leaked to the press, and then he got fired, right, by the Secretary of the Navy, who then had to resign because of his comments, was because you don't tell the world that one of your most expensive and effective military assets is waylaid. Now, that's the argument, right? That's the protocol that he broke, that he got called out for. Now, I've heard good arguments about why he should be reinstated. I've heard good arguments about why he shouldn't be. Not my, that's way above my pay grade. I get that. But I think what the damage that is claimed to have been done is telling the world that, we can't put this carrier, this asset, to sea right now. And it's a good point. So let's watch for that. That's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out over time. And it could get relatively ugly in some cases. On the virus, there's a weird thing going on. And it's in some places a positive, some places a negative. And that's the death rate in the Jewish communities. So in some instances, the death rate for Jewish communities is lower, and in numerous other cases, it's higher. So let me give you a couple of examples to give you a benchmark to think about. Okay, so as of yesterday, Israel had suffered 254 fatalities, population 9.2 million people. For math purposes, let's just say it's 10 million people, 254 deaths, it's 25 per million. Okay, gives you a thumbnail benchmark to work off of. Let's compare that to some other countries. All right, so Israel's at 25. Sweden, now we know Sweden is a test case because they didn't shut down, and so they may be front loaded with corona deaths. Their fatalities are about 10 times Israel's. They have 2,500 deaths. Population is slightly larger than 10 million, but pretty darn close. So a tenfold. Belgium, 11 million people, has 7,500 fatalities. So 30 times what Israel's is, okay? Austria, with 8.5 million people, slightly lower, about 600 dead. So they're about 2.5 times. The US, Jewish population of approximately 2 million, they don't have the exact figures because we don't break them out by communities, but based upon the reports from various communities, are deep into the 4-figure mark, in the thousands. Don't know exactly how many, but let's talk about, we'll talk about specific US communities in a second. Britain has 366 Jewish people who have died from corona. That's 1.7% of the deaths in the country where the Jewish population is only 1/3 of a percent. So Jews are dying at 6 times their proportional rate in the English population. France, 1,300 have died. They make up about 5% of the deaths, which again is 6 times what their population reference is. So something is going on. Now, I mean, I would hypothesize that it's the lifestyle of Jews, right? Because they're in tight communities. People would argue that the Orthodox communities are very, very social, and maybe they carried on after some quarantine. So, I don't know. I don't know if that's true across all these different countries. Morocco has 1,500 to 2,000 Jews, okay? They've lost 1% of their population. So most of the world is, 25, Israel's doing 25 per million, and these guys are losing 1% of their population. So it's really a problem. They think in Morocco was because there was a big wedding, Jewish wedding in March that people went to, and that was the vector, I think that's the right word, where it spread. In Morocco is interesting. I just saw a blurb yesterday that Israel sent a plane to rescue. There were 36 Jews Israelis in Morocco who couldn't get out. Morocco was putting up roadblocks to let them out. 10 of them died. The last 26, Israel through diplomatic channels, and they sent there was a plane that was sent by Sheldon Adelson here in the United States. He sent his personal jet, and they picked up the other 26 Israelis and flew them to Israel because Morocco wouldn't let an Israeli plane in, and they wouldn't let them out. And so after all these negotiations, it took a private plane to save these people. So there's just so much that's crazy. In New York, we know that New York is the largest Jewish community outside of Israel, right? It's a sole community. Estimated 2 million Jews. The number back in April was 700 dead, Jews dead in the Jewish community just in New York. So if Israel's got 250, 25 per million, 700 for 2 million is 350 per million. So New York Jews are dying at 12 times the rate that Israelis are. So it's very problematic. According to the health department in New York, the zip codes with the highest coronavirus infection rates are in Hasidic neighborhoods, in Borough Park, Williamsburg, and Crown Heights, all of them in Brooklyn. The at-home deaths, now these are not necessarily deaths that are counted as corona in the official statistics, but they just take gross numbers of deaths in March of 2019, 18, 17, and they compare it to 2020. The deaths in those neighborhoods at home are running 10 times the average over the years. So even deaths that are not being counted as corona, the death rate is enormous in these neighborhoods. So I'm very confident that the official numbers are very low, that they're much higher. And maybe as time goes on, they'll figure out how to reclassify and get more accurate statistics. You know, where, as everybody knows, we're having huge problems with statistics and measuring this virus for numerous reasons. I'm just going to read one little blurb about a neighborhood in Borough Park in a story, and this will give you a flavor, at least it did for me. So in the Brooklyn neighborhood of Borough Park, Shuliam Leifer's great uncle died of coronavirus. Then his grandmother fell ill, as did two of his cousins. The man who lived next door to his childhood home died on a Tuesday, and by Friday, the neighbor on the other side was dead. Their quote, "There's not a single Hasidic family that has been untouched," said Leifer, who's 34. "It's a plague on a biblical scale." It's, you know, I don't know of anybody who has had that experience here in California. Our situation isn't anywhere close to what New York City, much less the Jewish communities in New York, have been experiencing, but that's a pretty frightening story. Let me give you the flip side.
Dan?
So, yes.
We have a question from Sherwin. Sherwin, if you want to unmute yourself, I'll unmute you. Sherwin, can you hear me? You can unmute yourself. It won't let me unmute you if you want to ask your question. Well, I will ask the question. It says, Sherwin says, what is the testing and tracing capabilities in Israel? Can that explain their excellent rate?
Yeah, okay. So I think there's a ton of factors that are going into why Israel's rate is very low. I think first and foremost, they shut down the country very, very early, much earlier than anybody else. And so they stopped the incoming. So whatever was there, I think is what they dealt with. They are tracing people on their cell phones. I mean, they have taken civil liberties basically and thrown them out the door. And they have tracked. So if you test positive, they take your cell phone number, they put it in their records, and they trace where you've been and who you've been next to, and then they reach out and notify those people that they were exposed to somebody who has the virus. I think they're doing an exceptional job of testing and quarantining people much better than most other places. You know, I think they have something like 20 hotels that they have taken over because the hotels are empty. I mean, to me, this is a no-brainer. And they put people who are testing positive in them but don't require hospitalization. You can be symptom-free or you could have mild symptoms, and they put you in these hotels to do your quarantine, and they can monitor you, and you can't get out until you test twice negative, right? That you can't leave. There is a video that you can see that Israel has developed a little roadside kiosk, and it's completely self-contained. There's somebody in it, and they're hermetically sealed in it, and they put their hands through these things into gloves, and they do testing. You pull up to it, and you stand there, and you give a little information. I think you swipe your medical card, and it gives you all the information about the person, and then they test you through these gloves, and then they take the sample, okay, and then it must come back in a drawer, and then the whole booth on the outside, including the gloves, is decontaminated. So for the next person, it's completely sanitized. And, you know, these are the kind of things that Israel is doing. And of course, they're on the cutting edge of trying to develop treatments and trying to develop vaccines. But I think all of those come together. Now, Sherwin, I see that you've unmuted. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And it would be kind of a nice procedure to see followed in other countries as well.
Yes, of course it would. Now, let me just add on to that. Israel, the Israeli population is extremely cognizant of every individual's contribution to the whole. I mean, I think that's why their military is so effective. I think that's why they're the startup nation. I think, you know, there is a huge concept, in my opinion, of we in Israel. I think many, many other Western countries are much more, have more liberal concepts of civil liberties and more of a focus on the me versus the we. Now, this is my opinion. And so I think it's going to be very difficult. Now, also, Israel is a much smaller country, geographically and population-wise. So it's a little bit easier, although you could argue it's harder because people are in closer proximity, since the majority of people live in a very small band in the country. But to get compliance. But I think the Israelis understand, just like when a siren goes off, you run for the bomb shelter. There's no thinking about it. That's what you do. You have to, you have no choice. And I think in this case, it's the same kind of thing. So they're getting much better cooperation from the populace. And I don't know that, I mean, sure, it would be great if other countries could too. I just don't know how that's going to play. So.
But that is the answer to these wide discrepancies that you were talking about earlier between Israel's rate and other countries' rate. So, yeah. So yeah, okay. Thank you.
I think you're right, and thanks for the question. On the flip side of, for instance, the Hasidic neighborhoods having huge problems in New York, now they have thousands of people who have recovered from the virus. And so now one of the big pushes out in the corona world is antibodies, right? Antigens. And although it's unproven, there is very strong evidence from other viruses and other instances where sharing antibodies from somebody who has had whatever it is that we're talking about, in this case, COVID, can help other people who either have it or prevent them from getting it. And so the members of these Orthodox Jewish communities, the Haredi, are signing up by the thousands to donate blood, to donate actually plasma, it's not blood. The antibodies are antigens are in the blood, in the plasma, such that 12,000 plasma donors have signed up since April 4th. There's so many donors that appointments in the blood banks across New York and New Jersey are full, forcing donors to travel to Pennsylvania and Delaware to donate plasma. This article says that many in the Orthodox community view the return of their good health as a blessing. Quote, "We look at it as a gift that we've recovered because many people in our community did not recover." And I love this. "And for us, a gift is not something to sit back and enjoy and just talk about. It's a gift we have to use." I love that. So, you know, a community that has been so hard hit and so devastated is now doing what they can on the backside of those illnesses to try to help other people. And I think, Sherwin, I think that is an example where we can lead, and going forward, I think that the whole world, this whole country will need to do, because I think that's going to be the shortest distance to treating people who have it and or possibly preventing people from getting it. All of this is unknown. I get that. I'm out there on the positive limb. So, you know, let me have that view.
Yeah, just, excuse me, just one thing. Unfortunately, for that particular community, they didn't follow the social distancing and other things that were very well known in other communities. So in a way, they created their own problem themselves, and now they're solving it with the antibodies, which is great.
Yeah, no, I think that that's a valid argument. I think that that is true in some cases. I'm not sure if it's an exception rather than the rule. Certainly what you saw on the press were photos or videos of, a wedding or a funeral where there were lots of people. There's no question there were instances of it. I don't know how widespread it was. But certainly that contributed. Another current issue besides COVID, which is about all you hear on the news, if you turn on the news, another big issue that's happening right now that we need to talk about is Israel's, first of all, they formed a government. I believe it's being sworn in today or tomorrow. Amazing, almost went through 4th elections in a year. I mean, what other country on the planet in history has ever held 3 elections in a year? So I give Bennie Ganz the highest praise for basically saying my politics is not as important as having a functioning government in the middle of a crisis. I keep my core political beliefs and morals and ethics, but I'm going to waive certain challenges that I had to joining a coalition government. And of course, he lost half his party because of it. But now there's actually a government that has a large majority, not 1 or 2 seats, but I think about a dozen. Now, I know there's been something that's happened this week, and I can't explain what it is, but I think one party is threatening to leave already, but this is Israeli politics. But one of the main things on the table for this new government is the annexation or extending sovereignty over certain areas of the West Bank. And as a term of this government, they agreed that they wouldn't bring that up or do that until July 1st. And also the discussions with the United States are such that there should be a map agreed to between Israel and the United States before Israel acts to extend sovereignty or annex parts of the West Bank, mostly the Jordan Valley, and where there are significant Israeli communities. So this is a really interesting time for Israel, because even Peres, even Rabin, sorry about that, said, look, we can't give up the Jordan Valley. It's just way too critical to our defense. So it's not a surprise when Israel extended sovereignty over the Golan Heights, because it was so strategic. And turning it over to Syria was a very serious threat and would be disastrous in hindsight to have done that. The West Bank and the Jordan Valley especially is the same kind of thing. It's a natural defensive barrier that Israel has deemed they cannot protect with technology, that they need that physical buffer. Imagine if Egypt in the 73 war wasn't on the Suez Canal, but was right on the Egyptian border with the Sinai, with the Negev. And Israel hadn't had that space to absorb the initial attack. So, or even the attack from Syria in 73 in the Golan to absorb that. So I think that that's what Israel is all about. And the major settlement blocks, look, I mean, the better part, I think there's 400,000 Israelis now live in the West Bank. And I think 350,000 of them, if my numbers are correct, they're round figures, are in just a few settlement blocks. And I think Israel is going to extend the sovereignty over that. The United States has said, according to their peace plan that they put forward, that if Israel moves on this unilaterally, the U.S. won't object, as long as there's some agreement on exactly what those areas are. And that I think there are other conditions in it that, Israel will set aside any development in Area C for 4 years and wait for the Palestinians and hope the Palestinians will come to the table in the next 4 years to negotiate the rest of a peace agreement. But the days of waiting or giving the Palestinians a blanket veto over any progress in the process are over. the Israelis have the U.S. green light to move ahead with things that they believe will increase Israeli security. The Palestinians are going to go crazy. They are threatening to dissolve and disavow any and all agreements between the Palestinians and Israel that have been signed in the past. We'll see if they do that. They've threatened that many, many times in the past. If they do that and they end security cooperation with Israel in the West Bank, the overriding opinion is that Abbas and the PA will fall to Hamas, and or there will be a civil war in the West Bank because there will be no government. So I'm not sure how that's going to be. The Israelis understand that their time window is narrow, and their window is narrow because Joe Biden has come out and said he's against any unilateral actions. So if in November Biden wins the election, the cooperation and acquiescence of the United States to any Israeli move would be off the table. And that would complicate things substantially. So I think Israel is very intent on moving in the next 4 or 5 months. They can't do anything until after July 1st, but I think you will see come July 1st, in July and August, I think they'll get it done. And we'll see what the response is. Bennie Ganz has said, now Netanyahu is all for this, of course. Bennie Ganz has said when he joined the government that he, quote, supports annexation only with the backing of the international community, unquote. The question will be, how do you define the international community? A lot of Arab states, Muslim states, are saying, look, we're not objecting. Saudi Arabia is on record saying, yeah, it's fine. Yeah, we're tired of, quote, the mistakes that the Palestinian leadership has made. So, whether or not others make noise, get on board, object, I don't know. The European Union takes a unanimous vote. I don't even know how many members they have now. What is it, 26, 19, whatever the number is. They're never going to get unanimous consent to issue an objection, but individual countries will object, I'm sure of it. But I don't think that they're going to be able to object as an entity. And I'm sure that they will not get a UN resolution from the Security Council. They may get it from the General Assembly, but they won't get a Security Council because the US will veto it. So that's what's happening within the process of the peace process, which has been a lot more process than peace for many years. I mean, it's been years since the Palestinians have even agreed to sit down at the table. So I don't see anything changing in that except a bunch of noise. Now, whether or not there's violence because of it, I don't know. Mahmoud Abbas is now, in his 13th year or 14th year of a 4-year term. He's old. There's a lot of reports that he's infirm. If he dies, or when he dies, or becomes incapacitated, I will project here and now that there'll be a civil war in the West Bank. Israel will just try to seal the borders, and I think the Palestinians will fight it out among themselves. And I hope that a more moderate or reasonable governmental entity, because it's not a government, because it's not a country, will come out of it. But we could easily get a much more radical leadership running the Palestinians. So we'll have to wait and see. I read an interesting thing that I wanted to share, and it's a little bit of a head scratcher for me, because I have said that when Israel got the new F-35 strike fighters, the most advanced fighter in the world, and they're the first ones to get it outside the United States, that they would immediately use it against Lebanon and Syria to test the S-300 anti-aircraft missile defense system that Russia has sold both Syria and Iran, and are using it to defend the Russian bases in Lebanon, in Syria. I apologize, not Lebanon. So it's been interesting because Israel's been flying them. And they haven't had any problems with them. And they haven't had any problems with anti-aircraft missile defense systems. But I read an article that's very fascinating. It says that over the last 7 years, Syrian anti-aircraft systems have launched 700 missiles at IAF aircraft. Now, they hit one, and Israel readily admits that it was a pilot error. He wasn't following proper procedures, put himself in a situation where he was exposed, and he got hit. The plane was over Israel at the time. The pilot bailed out. We didn't lose pilot. We lost the plane. But this is really interesting, is that it says now that Moscow has supplied Syria with the S-300, in the last 20 months since it was operational in Syria, not a single missile has been launched from an S-300 battery in Syria at an IAF aircraft. Now, what's up with that? I mean, they sold them this mega expensive, several $100 million missile defense system, and Syria is not using it against Israeli aircraft. Let's take it apart for a second. Who's manning those batteries, those anti-aircraft batteries? And we know the Syrians, well, we know the Iranians are lousy at managing their anti-aircraft, right? They just shot down a civilian airliner recently. And then just last week on a ship, they shot a missile on a test, and they blew one of their own boats out of the water. So they're not real good at it. Syria, shot down a Russian aircraft. So they're not doing so well. But the batteries have been under the total control of Russian advisors and operators. So here's clue number one. The Russians don't trust the Syrians to man these systems that they sold them. Interesting. And so they're not permitting Syria to launch any of them. It's all Russian. And the reason this author hypothesizes that Russia hasn't fired any of them at Israeli aircraft, is because they're afraid they'll miss. And if the most advanced Russian anti-aircraft missile system in the world fails against the Israeli F-35, Russia and all of its customers will know that it's not an effective system, and they won't be able to sell it to anybody. Now, for years, Israel has said they have workarounds around the S-300 and S-400 missile systems, that they can get around them. But they can't prove it until Russia fires them at them. And it'll be interesting, because I've been like, there have been questions in the press for months. How is Israel able to bomb Syrian munition supplies that Iran is sending, right, across Syria into Lebanon for Hezbollah with impunity? Israel's been bombing them. I mean, there's dozens and dozens and dozens of raids by Israeli aircraft on Syrian and Iranian positions in Syria. So this maybe is an insight into that. I'd like to see them try. I'd like to see Israel be able to prove, because they need to know that if and when Israel ever has to go to Iran to take out their nuclear project, which is defended by the same defense system. So I'm sure Israel is very, very anxious to know how their planes will respond to that. So I always like to do a little miscellaneous, a little good news. There's one interesting piece out there that I saw. We in the United States, it's a constant conversation about the border wall, right? It's really interesting that there isn't a lot of, whenever there's an article, and of course it's off the front pages of the news these days, but the wall is being built, repaired, replaced along the border, especially here in San Diego, that there's numerous other countries that are doing walls on their borders. So here's a blurb that came out this week. Egypt recently started constructing a 7-meter, that's 21-foot high, steel wall equipped with electronic sensors along its 14 kilometers, so that's about 7.5, 8 miles long, border with Gaza. They already have a concrete barrier that's only 8 meters away from where they're building this wall. Well, obviously it wasn't effective. So they're building a 21-foot high wall to keep Palestinians in Gaza, Hamas, from infiltrating the Sinai, because Hamas aligns with the radical Islamists in the Sinai that are fighting the Egyptian military. So we had a little Zoom meeting recently with former Congressman Issa, who is running again for Duncan Hunter's seat. And he told a story about when he was in a helicopter, an Israeli helicopter over the Sinai, and he's looking at all these lights on the dash, and he's got red ones and green ones and blue ones, and he's asking the pilot, he goes, so what are these different triangles and colors? And he goes, well, yeah, those are Egyptian planes, and those are Israeli planes, and he's like, what do you mean? Because they're cooperating in Sinai against the radical Islamists. So Israel is allowing Egypt military presence that is far in excess of the Camp David Accord, and Egypt is allowing Israel to fly missions over Sinai. Now, Egypt's doing all the firing, just to be clear, but Israel is providing most of the intelligence. It's really an interesting cooperation. So there's a wall. Some just tidbits that kind of lighten it up a little bit. Here's an article about Israeli farmers. I think many of us have read that there are bee population problems. Okay, around the world, bees are dying, but at alarming rates. And of course, bees are what are normally used to pollinate. Israeli farmers are deploying pollinating drones because, number one, labor is very tough because of the coronavirus, and number two, because the bee populations are down. Israeli unmanned robotics, a company called Blue White Robotics, is using multiple drones flying simultaneously, equipped with innovative pods developed by a U.S. drone pollinator drop copter to dispense pollen. Is that cool? I mean, I love these little things. I think that's just really great. Here's a very positive statistic survey, in my opinion. There's a this month poll of Israeli Arabs, Arab Israelis. The proportion of non-Jewish people in Israel who define themselves primarily as Palestinian stands at 7%, down from 18% last year. That's a very positive, deep-set paradigm shift. And I'll give you another one. 51% self-identify of non-Jewish citizens in Israel, of Arab Israelis, self-identify as Israeli Arabs. 23% define themselves primarily as Israeli. My count, that's 74% who aren't defining themselves primarily as Arab, but primarily as Israeli. I think that's a great thing. Asked how much they, quote, feel like a real Israeli, 65% of Arabs said they completely agree, and 33% somewhat agree. So there's an enculturation trend that is happening with the Arabs in Israel that is a fantastic thing. I mean, you're never going to get quiet on the home front until everybody in society, or to the greatest extent possible, the population feels like they are equal or accepted or identify as members of that country and that society. And that's what I read out of these numbers, and I'm very encouraged by them, because you can also read surveys that come out where, you know, X% of Israeli Arabs believe that another intifada is the right way to go. I mean, those are the discouraging ones. So sometimes I can't reconcile them because they come a month or two within each other. Okay, here's a story that caught my eye because I'm from Detroit. On April 12th, in El Al Jet touched down at Detroit Metropolitan Airport carrying 3.5 million surgical masks, face shields, pulse oximeters from China, okay, for Michigan hospitals and retirement homes, et cetera, et cetera. Alon Kaufman and his wife own a manufacturing company. They manufacture in China. They repurposed their factory in China to make these emergency supplies And then they tried unsuccessfully, and I don't know why, to charter a plane from several different airlines to bring the equipment. Nobody would do it. So they reached out to El Al, and El Al sent a plane to China to bring these emergency supplies to Detroit, to Michigan. It's it's yet another example of Israel being there in so many different ways for so many different people, countries. It's heartwarming. Last piece, well, a couple pieces of good news, outstanding news, because this was really a problem a couple of years ago. The Sea of Galilee, Lake, the Canary, is full for the first time in at least 30 years. In just 2 years, because of rain, the Canary has risen by 5.5 meters. All right, so it's 16 centimeters from the top, from overflowing. So 550 meters up, and it's only got 16 centimeters to go before they have to open the floodgates. They're opening up some bypass gates, and they're sending water down the Jordan River to the Dead Sea, rather than having to open up other flood control gates. But that is an enormous benefit for Israel. And it was just a few years ago, it was within a couple of meters of hitting the intake valves, where they would have had to shut off the national water supply. So this is extremely good news for Israel. The last story I'll tell is there's an organization in Israel called Adopt a Dock. So in less than 3 weeks, more than 10,000 Israelis have signed up to adopt a doctor, okay, to assist healthcare professionals. So what they're doing is they are grocery shop, because all the medical professionals are so busy. They're just working night and day, right? So what they're doing is they're going grocery shopping. They're delivering home cooked meals. They're babysitting for their kids. They're walking their pets. Nearly 1,000 doctors, nurses, and other medical personnel now have a designated volunteer who cares for their personal needs. The grassroots organization now has a coordinator in every hospital in the country that has secured, and they have secured donations from private catering companies. When I read that, that just warms my heart about Israeli society. That is such an example of how they come together as a country. I mean, did I say 2 weeks or 3 weeks? 10,000 in 3 weeks, 10,000 volunteers. So, I think that goes back to the conversation with Sherwin about what's the ethos, how does Israeli society respond? I'm sure that it's happening here in the United States. I'm sure that in pockets, we're such a big country, but I wish it would, wherever it is, those things would get more press. I'm open to questions, conversation. The good news is there's not a ton of news out of the Middle East, because the bad news is all the news is Corona. And it's just put a stymie on so many things. So I see Jory and Jay have got a question. Go.
Hi, Dan.
Hi.
I wanted to ask, does AIPAC have a response to J Street's endorsement of Joe Biden, and Joe Biden welcoming the endorsement?
Okay, so great question. I hope everybody heard it, whether AIPAC has a response to J Street's endorsement of Joe Biden and Joe Biden's acceptance. AIPAC has had a policy forever of not endorsing, especially presidential contenders. We support all incumbents for Congress who are pro-Israel. And now the policy has changed that we will actively oppose candidates who are anti-Israel. But on the presidential scene, we stay out of that. We work with whoever gets in the White House. We understand that that goes back and forth over the terms and the years and the decades. And no matter what, we have to have a good relationship with the president who makes foreign policy. Congress can influence it. There, we're much more active and on the ground. But if you go one way or the other in a presidential election and you pick the wrong candidate, you back the wrong horse, you got a big problem. So no, there is not a response, and no, we're not. I don't expect one. Any question? Other questions? Well,
Sherwin, I think, has another question.
Yeah, I do. Daniel, first of all, thank you very much. It's been a really interesting presentation.
thank you.
I'm just wondering if you have any insight to the corruption charges and trial on Netanyahu, how that's going to affect the unity government and the annexation in the West Bank, and because you mentioned timing was pretty critical on that. So if you could give us some insight on that, I would appreciate it.
Sure. Okay, I don't know. I really don't know the specifics. My understanding is that a trial could start like next month, where Netanyahu is going to be splitting his time. I mean, that was the big hangup in forming the coalition government. Bennie Ganz said, "Look, I'm not joining a government that has a prime minister who is under indictment or is on trial." And now he's softened that stance because of the coronavirus and the fact that, without an official government, they couldn't legislate. They couldn't do anything. The country's been stuck for a year on whatever was before that, just continuing. So I don't know. I mean, it's going to be really weird to see a prime minister, an active prime minister, be put on trial, in Israel. How long it's going to take for them to try him, and then, if he loses, I'm sure he'll appeal, and whether that, I think he has to resign if he's convicted, and then Ganz would step in. I don't know that it will affect policy so much, because Ganz and Netanyahu are very much on the same page when it comes to almost all foreign relations issues, including the annexation of parts of the West Bank. I think where they differ is on social domestic policy, so you might see some change there. But as to the specific charges and the exact process, I'm really not sure, and I apologize for that. It's going forward. I think Netanyahu has been trying to find a way for a year or two to avoid get out from under the charges, but it looks like he's going to court. And you got to give the Israeli system credit. I mean, there's an ex-president of Israel in jail. There's an ex-prime minister of Israel in jail. Rank doesn't count. You're guilty, you're guilty. So it'll be very interesting to see. Other questions? Thank you. Anybody else? No? Well, Jay, you got to unmute.
Hi, Dan, and thank you again. Let me add my thanks for the wonderful job you just did. I was wondering, the likelihood of a two-state solution seems less and less likely as time goes on. And assuming that Israel annexes the West Bank, what percentage of the Jewish state remains Jewish?
Okay, so let me clarify, quote unquote correct, just the way that you said it. Israel's not going to annex the West Bank. They're going to annex or extend sovereignty over portions, very limited portions of the West Bank, and virtually none of it has any significant Palestinian population or Arab population. So I don't think it's going to change the demographic makeup of the state of Israel from a detrimental from bringing in Arabs. It will bring all the big settlement blocks. Like I said, I think it's 350 out of 400,000 people who live in the West Bank now in as official Israeli citizens. So in that respect, I don't know exactly the numbers. I think the numbers are somewhat on 75%. Israel right now is about 75% Jewish, 20% Arab, 5% everything else, something along those benchmarks. if you add another 500,000 Jews, or 350,000, I'm assuming most of the people in the settlement blocks are Jewish. I'll go with that assumption. I can't represent that for sure. And I can't even represent for sure that they're not already counted in the Israeli census. But let's assume they're going to be added. That would make probably maybe a 2% difference in the, let's see, 350 out of 7, 5% difference. So you dilute that, so about maybe 4%. So maybe it goes from 75 to 79% Jewish. It's not going to change the Arab population, I don't believe at all. That answer your question?
Well, not exactly. I was on the assumption that, Israel is getting in a position to ratchet things up as the Palestinians become weaker and weaker, and that at some point we do have the possibility of annexation of the whole West Bank.
Okay, I got it. All right, that was the other part of your, that this two-state solution you don't think is going to happen. See, I think the two-state solution will still happen. And I think that the Israel is not interested in, at any time, in annexing, I'm not even sure how many Arabs are in the West Bank. Let's call it 1.5 million, 2 million Arabs. I'm not sure exactly the number, into the state of Israel. And I think that at some point there will be a demarcation and a political entity that runs the West Bank where with the Arab population. I don't know when that's going to be or how that's going to look. I'm pretty sure it'll be demilitarized for an extended period of time. But other than that, I just don't see that Israel. Look, I know that the ultra-religious want to annex all of Judea and Samaria, right? It's biblical Israel. It is a big sacrifice to give up those centers of the West Bank and Jewish history, just as Ben-Gurion compromised in 47 with the UN partition, which didn't give him anywhere near what he thought he was going to get under the Balfour or the Peel declarations of 1917 and 1920. You take what you can get and move from there, I think. And I think Israel, if they can find a way to demarc the West Bank between Jews and Arabs, I think that they'll do it. I don't think they'll take it on. So I'm just arguing with your premise. So if they did it, yes, it'd be a big demographic problem. But I don't think it's anywhere near as dire as what it was a few years ago when the Arab birth rate was substantially higher than the Jewish birth rate. The Jewish birth rate is now, in many instances, exceeding the Arab birth rate. And that can be seen as an elevation of the Arab lifestyle, because worldwide, when you raise the standard of living of people, their fertility rate goes down. That's a whole nother discussion about why that would be, but that holds true almost everywhere. What else?
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you. Thank you for joining. Really, it's weird, it's like I want to be moving around. I want to be, walking and talking like I always do. I always got spilkas.
Yeah.
And and I miss sharing a bagel afterwards or before or whatever, and coming up and talking. But I really thank you so much for those of you that joined today. I really appreciate it. I always have fun doing this, and so.
Thank you so much, Dan. And everybody can, if you want to unmute and clap, you're welcome to do that.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very interesting. And your love for Israel is palpable, really.
Thank you.
Good to
Yes.
see it.
Next month, we'll have Mark Silverstein back on the calendar on June 15th, a Monday morning, live from Israel. So save the date and be looking out for our email blasts. You'll be able to register through Zoom for that as well. Coming up tomorrow, we're having a virtual senior lounge coffee chat with me and Sarah. Tell us what you're interested in, what kinds of things you're doing to occupy your time, whatever's on your mind. We can share stories, share jokes. That's tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. We have a JCC Social Circles book club coming up. We're going to be discussing the book, The Alchemist. You read the book beforehand, and then we're going to have a discussion on Wednesday, May 27th. We're also, JCC Social Circles has a a movie club where we're discussing different movies. This month will be about Sophie's Choice. So you watch the movie sometime ahead of time, and then we'll have a discussion on Tuesday, May 26th. So look out for those. Those actually were in your the last email blast where you read about this one as well. If you're not receiving our email blast, please contact me or Sarah. We'll be happy to put you on the list. And thank you so much for joining us today. And we'll send a follow-up email with that information about how to hear Dr. Wilf, Einat Wilf, about her latest book. So thank you so much for joining us, everybody. Stay
Thank
safe.
you.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.
Hi, Dan.
Bye. Good to see all you guys.
Same here.